fall for a Karpapa unfolds as an intimate psychological portrait rather than a conventional narrative inciting incident. And its power lies in how thoroughly it centers Sydney's interiority, while allowing the audience, particularly queer women, to recognize the familiar architecture of a life built around safety, self-containment, and unspoken longing. Sydney's opening reflections establish solitude as a deliberate choice rather than a deficit, positioning nature, books, and thought as spaces where she experiences coherence and relief from the constant interpretive labor required in social environments. A labor many queer girls learn early when their instincts, rhythms, or desires do not align with what is expected of them. Her preference for forests over cities and quiet over crowds speaks not only to introversion, but to a deep mistrust of systems that reward visibility, competition, and performative belonging. And when she invokes Edward Hopper's paintings, she articulates a visual shorthand for a feeling many LGBTQ+ viewers know well: the sense of being surrounded by people yet fundamentally alone, occupying the same structures without sharing the same interior maps. This reference is especially resonant because Hopper's work captures isolation without spectacle, mirroring how queer alienation often operates quietly, normalized by routine rather than marked by overt rejection. Sydney's declaration that she feels safer in her quiet world establishes safety as her primary value, a value that has likely been reinforced by subtle social cues, parental expectations, and the absence of language for desires that feel both real and unspeakable. For many queer women, this resonates as an early coping strategy, choosing inwardness not because connection is undesired, but because connection has never been modeled as something that could meet them where they are. The moment she says that everything changed last summer signals that the coming disruption will not be romanticized but experienced as a loss of equilibrium, and the arrival of Carrie fulfills this promise with immediacy and force. Carrie's entrance is invasive, not because she is cruel, but because she is unfiltered, rifling through drawers, dismissing Sydney's candles, asserting her presence loudly and unapologetically. And in doing so, she disrupts the carefully regulated environment Sydney has constructed to protect herself. This disruption mirrors the way queer desire often arrives in real life, not as a gentle invitation, but as an intrusion that challenges existing coping mechanisms, making it impossible to maintain the same distance from feeling. Sydney's immediate hostility toward Carrie reads as fear rather than judgment, and the extremity of her reaction underscores how threatening Carrie's way of being feels to someone who has learned that control equals safety. Carrie embodies everything Sydney has been taught to avoid: unpredictability, loudness, social ease, and a disregard for rules that have likely been presented to Sydney as necessary for survival. For lesbian and broader LGBTQ+ audiences, this dynamic is painfully familiar, recalling the early fixation on another girl who seems to live without apology, whose freedom feels simultaneously offensive and magnetic because it exposes the costs of self-denial. Sydney's narration frames Carrie as spoiled, rebellious, and problematic, yet the film's restraint invites viewers to understand this framing as part of Sydney's defensive worldview rather than an objective assessment, reminding us that queer self-understanding often begins with misrecognition and projection. Carrie's backstory, sketched through Sydney's resentment, situates her as someone who has already been marked as trouble by adults, reinforcing a cultural pattern where girls who refuse containment are pathologized, while quieter girls are rewarded for compliance. The mother's alignment with Carrie deepens Sydney's sense of displacement, reflecting a real-life experience many queer women recall from adolescence, when parental attention shifts toward the child who appears more legible, more socially active, or more aligned with normative scripts, leaving the quieter child to internalize the belief that being low maintenance is the price of love. Sydney's phone call with her mother crystallizes this dynamic with painful clarity, as she carefully presents herself as the good daughter, emphasizing her lack of interest in dating, her focus on school, and her contrast with Carrie's wildness as evidence of her worth. This performance resonates deeply with queer audiences because it reveals how often girls learn to translate their difference into virtues that will be rewarded rather than questioned, framing emotional withdrawal as maturity and invisibility as safety. Sydney's insistence that she is not like Carrie functions as both shield and plea, a way of securing approval by aligning herself with restraint rather than risk. Yet the very need to make this comparison exposes the fragility of that safety. Even as Carrie is absent during the call, her presence dominates Sydney's self-definition, suggesting that the disruption has already moved inward, reorganizing Sydney's sense of herself whether she consents to it or not. The later domestic moments, seemingly mundane exchanges about clothing and casual affection, are charged with observation, as Sydney watches Carrie with a vigilance that signals emotional engagement, even as she resists naming it. This watchfulness mirrors a stage many queer women recognize, when attention lingers despite conscious resistance, and another woman's movements, voice, and presence begin to occupy disproportionate mental space. Society's discomfort with women expressing love for each other is embedded in the scene not through explicit prohibition, but through the subtle rewards and punishments distributed to each girl. Sydney's quietness and lack of visible desire are implicitly validated by her mother and by cultural narratives of being good, while Carrie's openness and rebellion are framed as problems to be managed. This discomfort persists because women's same-sex desire destabilizes systems built on predictability, obedience, and male-centered narratives. And the film captures this destabilization by showing how Sydney's safety depends on suppression while Carrie's presence threatens exposure. Symbolically, Sydney represents the inward-turning queer subject who has learned to hide in order to survive, while Carrie represents the externalized figure of possibility who refuses to make herself small, and their forced cohabitation mirrors the internal conflict many queer women experience between the selves they present and the selves they fear. This conflict reflects real-life queer development, where attraction often emerges first as disruption rather than desire, and where the path toward authenticity requires the dismantling of coping mechanisms that once ensured safety. The power struggle between Sydney and Carrie is therefore not merely interpersonal but existential, a clash between silence and expression, control and chaos, invisibility and presence, and the scene's emotional truth lies in its refusal to resolve this tension prematurely or romantically. For women more broadly, the scene resonates as a portrait of what happens when another person enters your life and exposes the limits of the identity you have carefully constructed, forcing you to confront unmet needs and unacknowledged desires. Many women, queer or not, recognize the experience of having their sense of self disrupted by someone who embodies qualities they have been taught to suppress, and the fear that accompanies the realization that safety built on denial may no longer be sustainable. In real life, queer women often recognize themselves in Sydney's early strategies of retreat, self-justification, and moral comparison, and in the slow dawning awareness that solitude, however protective, can also become a cage. By centering Sydney's interior narration and honoring her fear alongside her fascination, Pepper challenges the idea that queer awakening must be dramatic or overt, instead portraying it as a gradual erosion of defenses that once felt necessary. The scene does not promise romance or redemption, nor does it vilify either girl. Instead, it offers recognition, affirming that queer truth often begins with discomfort, with the unsettling realization that the life you built to survive may no longer be enough to live fully. For LGBTQ+ audiences seeking authenticity rather than spectacle, this opening affirms that becoming visible is not a single moment of declaration, but a process of allowing oneself to be changed by another woman's presence, even when that change feels frightening, destabilizing, and profoundly real.